Starship nails a complete launch-to-landing mission profile, Starliner finally launches its first crew into orbit, and China becomes the first country to launch from the far side of the moon. I'm Elysia Segal for NSF. It's Friday the 7th of June, and there's much more to come this week in Spaceflight, and it was epic. After years of development, 2 uncrewed test flights, and 2 launch scrubs, Boeing Starliner finally launched this week on its crewed flight test mission, carrying humans into orbit for the first time. Liftoff of the Atlas V rocket with Starliner Calypso on top took place on June 5th at 14:52 UTC from Space Launch Complex 41 in Florida. Atlas and Starliner successfully carried NASA astronauts Barry Butch Wilmore and Sunita Sunny Williams into orbit and on their way to the International Space Station. Teams had first attempted to launch this mission back on May 6th, but an issue with an oxygen relief valve on the Centaur upper stage caused a scrub just under 2 hours before the flight. Almost immediately after this scrub, teams also discovered a helium leak on a manifold on Starliner's service module and worked through 2.5 weeks of investigations and assessments to see when they could attempt a new launch. That second launch attempt was then slated to happen on June 1st. Multiple problems arose during the countdown for this second attempt, but teams managed to get them resolved as the countdown approached terminal count at T-4 minutes. But only 10 seconds later, the clock stopped, causing a scrub. It was later revealed that one of the 3 redundant ground computers in charge of the time-sensitive parts of the launch took 6 seconds too long to get into flight configuration. The slow start was the result of a failed power supply and caused the countdown to halt out of an abundance of caution. But third time's the charm, and finally, on June 5th, Butch and Sunny boarded Starliner Calypso for their third flight attempt, and this time, the countdown proceeded without any major issues. When T-0 came around, Atlas V took to the Floridian sky. Coincidentally, this also happened to be the rocket's 100th flight. After a nearly 12-minute ride uphill, Atlas V's Centaur upper stage dropped Starliner off in an intentionally low orbit. This orbit allowed the capsule to re-enter, even if its propulsion systems failed. Fortunately, this wasn't needed, and Starliner completed its orbital insertion burn half an hour after liftoff. On their way to the space station, the astronauts performed manual piloting demonstrations and had a rest period. However, it wasn't all smooth sailing. During ascent, the capsule's cooling system that's used during launch and landing used more water than expected, but, well, as a system that's used for launch, it had done its job. Even though this could be replenished, ground teams ran some additional tests to better understand this cooling system's performance. With Starliner in orbit, it used its radiator systems for cooling, and this system was no longer needed. On the way to the ISS, teams discovered that extra helium leaks had developed on Starliner's service module apart from the one found right after the first launch scrub. These leaks were successfully isolated, which meant the issue wasn't a showstopper, and the capsule continued on its way to the ISS while the crews prepared for docking. The spacecraft also experienced some thruster issues while approaching the ISS, with up to 5 thrusters being disabled. This delayed the docking procedure, but after some troubleshooting by ground teams, 4 of these thrusters returned to normal, the issues were resolved, and Starliner docked to the ISS a few hours later. Calypso achieved hard capture with the ISS front docking port at 17:57 UTC on June 6th, and it will stay there for another 8 days before coming back to Earth. With Butch and Sunny now inside of the ISS, the crew will continue to test Starliner Calypso while at the station until their return. As mentioned before, this is nominally planned to be for 8 days, but weather and hardware will ultimately dictate when it's time for Butch and Sunny to come back home.
Yeah, we are thrilled as well. I'm not sure we could have gotten a better welcome. I mean, we had music, we had Matt was dancing. It was great.
From one star vehicle to another, let's talk about Starship's 4th test flight. The world's most powerful rocket flew for a 4th time this week, and I gotta say, we are all still shocked here at NSF at how that went. Let's start from the beginning, though, from the liftoff. Liftoff of Ship 29 and Booster 11 took place on June 6th at 12:50 UTC from Starship's first orbital launch pad at Starbase, Texas, heading downrange over the Gulf of Mexico and kickstarting an amazing 1-hour test flight. There was a slight delay before launch due to a small issue with the launch pad ground systems, but SpaceX teams were able to solve it, and Starship's countdown went smoothly after that. This was the second flight in a row with no holds and a clean countdown all the way to T0. Booster 11 successfully ignited all of its 33 Raptor engines and proceeded with liftoff, although shortly after that, one of the outer 20 engines unexpectedly shut down. But Super Heavy proved its engine-out capability and successfully continued through its ascent with that engine out up until hot staging. Now during hot staging, all but the 3 center engines are shut off. The ship ignites its 6 engines and then it separates. All of this happened successfully, allowing Booster 11 and Ship 29 to go their separate ways. The booster then reignited the middle ring of 10 engines to perform its boost back burn, and, unlike the last flight, this one succeeded with all 13 engines running for the full duration. After the engines were cut, the booster reoriented itself for re-entry, and during this flip, the hot staging ring separated from the booster cleanly. Unlike Flight 3, this time the booster seemed to be able to control its attitude throughout re-entry without any issues. We were also treated to some amazing shots from the booster's forward dome, forward-facing cameras, seeing the contrail of the booster as it came through the atmosphere. But that was just an appetizer in terms of visuals. When it was time for the landing burn, only 12 out of the 13 engines ignited, but Super Heavy, once again, demonstrated its engine-out capability also for landing. The booster successfully slowed down and transitioned to just the center 3 engines for a successful soft touchdown on the water in the Gulf of Mexico. Meanwhile, Ship 29's flight proceeded nominally as it was pushed along by its Raptors until they cut off at T plus 8 minutes and 23 seconds. This left Starship on its almost but not quite orbital trajectory. Now, as you may remember, Starship performed some tests during its coast phase on the previous flight, but this time SpaceX went back to basics and just let Ship 29 coast through space. While SpaceX lost external cameras on Ship 29 for a while, they luckily came back for the spicy part of the flight, which was, of course, the entry. Prior to that, there seemed to not be any signs of attitude control issues like with Ship 28, and the ship kept a stable and controlled attitude all the way through. Initially, re-entry seemed very calm and controlled. The plasma slowly and visibly built up outside of Ship 29 until the SpaceX engineers called out that the increase in temperature had stopped. The visuals were also, though, absolutely stunning, showing a display of colors ranging from deep red to purple, blue, and bright green. Even the ship's leeward side started to turn into different colors as the stainless steel heated up during re-entry. The serene views ended abruptly, though, as the vehicle approached maximum aerodynamic pressure. The ship's starboard-forward flap succumbed to the heat of re-entry and visibly started disintegrating at an altitude of about 55 kilometers. As debris was falling off, the camera views became obstructed and even cut out completely a few times. Undeterred, Ship 29 continued to push through re-entry and kept attitude control on its journey towards the Indian Ocean. The vehicle passed through the plasma phase of re-entry and started its skydiving maneuver ahead of its flip and landing burn in the ocean. To the surprise of everyone, despite the damaged flap, Ship 29 still managed to relight its 3 engines, perform the flip and landing burn, and softly splash down in the water. Despite the issues it encountered, the main goal of this flight, which was to successfully control both the booster and ship all the way through re-entry and down to a landing, was completed. This all but proves that even with the hardest challenges thrown at these 2 vehicles, they were still capable of achieving this goal. Things are just going to get better from here on out. Landings will become more reliable, and ships will experience less damage during re-entry. SpaceX certainly has lots of data to learn from this flight to carry out even better test flights in the future. And as the company put it on its website, the payload for this Starship flight was the data, and Starship certainly delivered. Elon already mentioned on social media to perhaps expect a booster catch attempt on the next flight, so there are definitely a lot of exciting milestones ahead for Starship, and even more mind-blowing views to see in the future. Now, before closing out this Starship section, I'd be remiss if I weren't to mention that we are already working on a deep dive of this flight to point out all the little details and everything that happened during the flight, almost down to the second. Don't think that this was that kind of analysis, because there is plenty more to talk about with this flight, so stay tuned for when that comes out. Now, if you thought the historic events ended there, well, you'd be wrong. This week, China successfully landed its Chang'e 6 lander on the far side of the moon, becoming the second spacecraft to land on that side of our celestial companion. But it was also the first to launch from the far side of the moon, because Chang'e 6 is the first mission to attempt returning samples from there back to Earth. See what I said about historic events? The mission was originally launched on a Chang'e 5 rocket back on May 3rd. It took a few weeks for the spacecraft to reach the moon, but on June 1st at 22:23 UTC, the Chang'e 6 lander touched down on the lunar surface in the Apollo basin. Once on the moon, the lander collected samples and deployed a previously unannounced mini rover that took this awesome picture of Chang'e 6 on the surface of the moon. But the secret rover was not the only payload carried by the lander. It also carried instruments contributed by international partners. France provided the detection of outgassing radon, or DORN, instrument that measures radon gas leaving the lunar crust, which will allow scientists to gain new insight in how water molecules move toward the moon's poles. Another instrument on board Chang'e 6 is the Swedish Negative Ions on Lunar Surface, or NILS experiment. This instrument detects the presence of negative ions produced by interactions between the solar wind and the lunar surface. Then there's the Italian Instrument for Landing Roving Laser Retroreflector Investigations, which is a pair of passive laser retroreflectors that will be used to precisely measure the distance to the lander from orbit. The final international contribution was a Pakistani CubeSat called iCubeQ, which was released by the spacecraft a few days after launch. With the samples collected and safely stored, it was time to make the trip back to Earth. Liftoff of the Chang'e 6 ascent module took place on June 3rd at 23:38 UTC, inserting the samples into a low lunar orbit and sending them on their way for rendezvous with Chang'e 6's orbital module. Docking between the two modules successfully took place 2 days later on June 6th at 6:48 UTC, successfully transferring the samples to the re-entry capsule about 36 minutes later. The next step in the mission timeline is for the return capsule to start its journey back to Earth, which should begin around June 20th. The orbital module with the capsule attached will take about 5 days for the trip back home, as re-entry and landing are currently scheduled for June 25th. Needless to say, we'll be keeping an eye on it, and we'll let you know what happens with it in a future episode. NASA has given us an update on its Hubble Space Telescope, and unfortunately, it's not great news. If you've followed along with our channel, you may know that one of the telescope's remaining 3 gyroscopes has been malfunctioning as of late. This has prompted NASA to change the way that it points the telescope to a method that uses only one gyro. While this still allows Hubble to do much of its amazing science, things will slow down slightly. The failed gyroscope had been causing trouble since it was installed on Hubble during the last servicing mission in 2009. Because of this, NASA disabled it in 2011, but the agency had to turn it back on in 2018 after 3 other gyros failed. Since then, the gyroscope has continued to cause issues, including one issue that made the telescope enter safe mode as recently as May 24th. It kept giving faulty data, like indicating that the spacecraft was rotating at maximum rate, regardless of Hubble's actual rotation. Out of the 6 gyros installed on the telescope in 2009, 4 have now failed. The remaining 2 are of a different type with a significantly longer lifespan compared to the first 3 that failed, so NASA hopes they'll chug along for a bit longer than the rest. With the new operation mode, Hubble only needs a single gyro to point itself at its target, keeping the second functional gyroscope as a backup. However, there are some limitations. The new pointing method is slower and also limits the time at which some targets can be observed. Hubble will also no longer be able to track moving objects closer than Mars. All in all, these limitations add up to a loss of 12% of observation time, but will at least keep the telescope going. But wait, didn't Jared Isaacman offer NASA to boost and service Hubble during a Polaris mission? Well, the agency believes the risk of such a mission is too high, and therefore decided not to pursue the option. NASA is confident that Hubble can continue operations until its re-entry, which is currently expected to occur somewhere in the mid-2030s. So, hopefully there will be much more interesting science to come. Now let's take a quick glimpse at some other stories across space. On June 4th, Oleg Kononenko spent his 1,000th day in space and became the first person to have reached this amazing milestone. Kononenko is currently on his 5th spaceflight on a year-long mission that arrived at the International Space Station in September of last year. He's scheduled to return to Earth on Soyuz MS-25, which is set to land on September 24th. The previous record for most time spent in space was held by Gennady Padalka, who had spent a total of 878 days in space when he landed at the end of his 5th and last spaceflight in September of 2015. Kononenko already broke Padalka's record a few months ago, and we featured that in an episode of This Week in Spaceflight. But now that record has been pushed all the way to 1,000 days, and it's still going. This week, the European Space Agency announced that it had performed a dry run for its upcoming Ariane 6 launch vehicle. Dry run, I guess maybe we can call it a dry dress rehearsal? This test validated the software and the link between the rocket and launch control. From what the agency announced, it seems like this test was successful, and just a few days later, ESA Director Josef Aschbacher announced that it is now targeting July 9th for the first launch of Ariane 6. While Ariane 6's development was delayed and its test program was less than perfect, the last few months of integrating the first launch vehicle and getting it ready for flight have gone by smoothly. The final milestone to complete before launch is a wet dress rehearsal, which should take place in a couple of weeks, after which Ariane 6 will finally be ready for its inaugural flight from Europe's spaceport in French Guiana. Relativity Space once again fired its new Eon-R engine at the test stand at NASA's Stennis Space Center. However, this time, the burn was performed at 100% power and lasted 180 seconds, which is longer than the maximum duration needed for Terran-R's first stage flight. Eon-R is a mostly 3D printed rocket engine powered by methane and liquid oxygen. Relativity Space is currently developing its Terran-R rocket, which features 13 of these engines on its reusable first stage. This successful test is an important step towards the rocket's first flight, which is currently scheduled for 2026. We can't wait to see a lot more blue fire in the future. Believe it or not, Flight 4 wasn't the only exciting thing to happen at Starbase this week. The flapless Ship 26 performed a static fire on the brand new test stand at the Massey's site. The new stand replaces the old suborbital pad, which has already been demolished to make space for the second orbital launch site at Starbase. This static fire gives Ship 26 the unique distinction of being the first, and perhaps the only, ship to static fire at both the suborbital site and Massey's. It'll just come down to whether SpaceX tests Ship 30 on this Massey stand or not, so we'll see. Now let's go over all of the traffic in space during the past week, although we've already covered some of it, and then we'll see what's coming up next week in spaceflight. Starting off a busy week, we had the launch of Galactic Energy's Series 1 on May 31st at 23:39 UTC on a flight named Heroes. The flight lifted off from the Zhoushan Satellite Launch Center in China and carried 5 satellites into sun-synchronous orbit. Among those satellites were 3 weather satellites for the Yunyao 1 constellation. The other 2 spacecraft were technology demonstration satellites that will conduct on-orbit laser communication tests. This was the 26th and last launch of May, bringing the total number of launches performed worldwide to 107. SpaceX once again led the world with 13 launches during May, at least in UTC, but we'll get to that later, followed by China, as usual, in second place. So far, we're on track for 250 launches worldwide by the end of the year, so there's a lot more action to be expected. Going into the month of June, we had a spacecraft arrival at the International Space Station. The ISS crew received a delivery of food, fuel, and supplies on June 1st by none other than the Progress MS-27 spacecraft that had launched the previous week. Progress autonomously docked to the station's Poisk module, delivering over 2,500 kilograms of cargo to the orbiting laboratory. Half of that consisted of science equipment, while the other half contained fuel, food, and other consumables. The spacecraft is planned to stay at the station until November. The first launch of June took place on June 1st. At 6:37 UTC, a Falcon 9 lifted 23 Starlink V2 mini satellites into low Earth orbit. The flight took place from Space Launch Complex 40 in Florida. This was the 14th flight of B-1076, which landed successfully on a short fall of gravitas. This mission was notable for the record-breaking drone ship turnaround, as the drone ship supported another Starlink launch only 3 days and 12 hours earlier. With that, it beat the previous record held by the same drone ship by an impressive 18 hours. The flight also took place while in Florida. It was still May, so sure, technically SpaceX actually had 14 Falcon 9 launches during May, which of course just makes it another record to add to the long list of records by this company. Another Starlink mission took place from the same pad just a few days later on June 5th at 2:16 UTC. This time it was carrying 13 direct-to-cell satellites on board, along with 7 Starlink V2 mini satellites, all going into low Earth orbit. The booster supporting this flight was B-1067. It flew for the 20th time and was the 4th booster to break this milestone. It ended its flight by successfully landing on Just Read the Instructions and will be coming back to port for another launch really soon. With the 2 Starlink launches this week, SpaceX has launched a total of 6,571 satellites, of which 453 have re-entered and 5,232 have moved into their operational orbit. Just an hour later, Rocket Lab launched its 7th Electron mission of the year. The rocket lifted off at 3:15 UTC from the company's Launch Complex 1B in New Zealand and launched NASA's Pre-Fire and Ice mission into sun-synchronous orbit. Now, if you watched last week's episode, this might sound familiar. Indeed, this launch was the second of 2 back-to-back missions for NASA's Polar Radiant Energy in the Far Infrared experiment, or Pre-Fire for short. The 2 CubeSats will measure how much heat radiates into space at Earth's poles after being absorbed in the tropics. Studying this flow of heat helps scientists understand how it affects climate and climate change. And to wrap up the week, we had the launch of another Series 1, again from Zhoushan, on June 6th at 5 o'clock UTC. This time, it lifted 3 Earth observation satellites into sun-synchronous orbit. With Galactic Energy's orbital test platform called Eros as an additional passenger, the launch was fittingly dubbed Love on Top. Eros is an upgraded version of Series 1's upper stage that is designed to stay in orbit as a test platform. The company offers Eros for testing new devices, technologies, and even biological experiments. This time, it will test an electric thruster in orbit. Going into the next week, or rather tonight, we'll have the first of 2 back-to-back Starlink launches. The first will be from Florida, debuting a new Starlink group, in this case being Starlink Group 10. The launch window for this mission is set to open on June 7th at 22:58 UTC. Some few hours later, another Starlink will take place from Vandenberg, carrying more Starlink direct-to-cell satellites. The launch window for this mission is set to open on June 8th at 10 o'clock UTC. Virgin Galactic is also planning a flight for June 8th when the company will fly its Spaceship 2 VSS Unity spaceplane from Spaceport America. This is set to be the spaceplane's final commercial flight as the company prepares to move on to its next generation of spaceships. And that's your weekly update of spaceflight news. We'll see you all again next week to recap this week in spaceflight.